Hello everybody, Nick again here with Scoggin-Dickey. Today we are going to be discussing connecting rods. If you saw us last week, we were discussing pistons, and actually a suggestion from one of the guys in our race shop said, you know, you talked about the piston, what about the thing that connects it to the crank? And honestly, he's right. This is actually a higher fail point than a piston. In a rotating assembly and a short block assembly, you don't really hear too much about failed cranks or blocks or some pistons, but you actually hear about this, a bent rod, a snapped rod, it broke, and of course it sawed the block in half as it flung around, usually due to somebody pushing a build much further than what it was meant to be, what it was meant for, or actually a bad tune. Not to call out any tuners out there, but it does happen. When you're dealing with some high horsepower applications, mistakes happen, and unfortunately a lot of damage can result. But of course, picking the right parts can make sure that your build lasts a long time, or can make sure they can withstand a little bit of abuse in case you accidentally push it too far. So let's go over some of the different kinds of connecting rods, the designs, the forgings, the materials. And to start off with is actually something that we hear a whole lot. Now, I don't happen to have an OEM connecting rod in front of me for like an LS application. I do have an Ls7 one here made out of titanium. We'll discuss that here in a minute. But there's a lot of people that discuss the cracked cap powdered forged metal rods, and they are a forged rod, and that's what we hear a lot of misconception, and people go, well, wait a minute, that isn't a forged, it's powdered metal, that's not. And it's like, let us explain it in its entirety to explain why it's called that and why it's still considered a forging. Now, when you start with an aftermarket rod like some of these here, say this real tough boosted I-beam that's made for, you know, supercharged, turbocharged applications. This is made from a solid piece of forged steel, and they continue to heat it and form it into what it is in my hands right now. The powdered metal is actually how the metal starts. It actually starts in a powder. It is the same kind of steel, but it's in a powdered form. It is then poured into a mold and then pressured and heated over and over to make that connecting rod, and that's still a forging. It's actually a very tough forging, kind of like what we were talking about in last week's piston video. The hyper-eutectic piston was made as kind of a middle-of-the-road application between a cast piston, you know, kind of the older, cheaper stuff, and of course an overkill forged piston. The factory doesn't want to make a bunch of high-dollar connecting rods and put them in an engine if it doesn't really need it. That cost just gets passed down to the consumer, and of course nobody wants to pay more for something if they're not ever going to use it or need it. And the powdered forged metal rods are actually plenty strong. When you hear about people taking a junkyard 4.8, 5.3, or 6 liter, or 6.2, and boost it to the moon, and they make passes all summer long down the drag strip and make passes on the street, and they're making 600, 700, 800, 1,000 horsepower at the tire. They are really doing it with a factory connecting rod. We definitely wouldn't recommend it if you call and ask us. We want your build to last a little bit longer than those. Fortunately, those builds are kind of on borrowed time. We want your build to last a longer time, so if you are looking to do that, a quick plug, give us a call. Let us set you up with a piston and rod combo so you can enjoy that performance. It might cost you a couple extra bucks, but you get to enjoy it for years and years, not months and months. But those rods are plenty strong, and that is a testament to how strong they are. I know it's on borrowed time, but they still last. They still make run after run. You know, 15, 20 pounds of boost is pretty crazy for a stock rotating assembly. But eventually we go far enough to where we need some of the aftermarket ones here. Let's start off with kind of the one that everybody knows. The nice old-fashioned forged I-beam connecting rod. I-beam is still the design that are in most production engines. This one is made by Scat. This is actually their 5140 forging, and I think it's the SIR series. And these are still great. ARP hardware, much beefier design than the stock that you'd find in like a small block Chevy. They also make them for big blocks and LSs. They make them in different lengths, and they are a little bit stronger. These are definitely a great budget application if you still want quality, you still want strength, but you don't want to break the bank, and you're building a stroker. You need that 6-125 rod, and you don't have a need for a comp star. You don't have a need for a Manly Turbo Tough rod. You know, you just need something that's going to make the connection work. It's going to get you the right, you know, assembly height, the right quench, so you have to find an aftermarket rod. These are a great choice. But the one that everybody knows is a 4340 forging. Of course, that's it's still a steel forging, but it's a stronger steel forging. And the next step up, of course, is the H-beam design. And of course, going from an I-beam to an H-beam is a stronger design. This does add some crankcase windage, is something to keep in mind. These do cause a little bit more care in your PCV breathing system. You know, you might need an extra catch can, especially if you're building a stroker anyway. But these do actually cause a little bit extra windage in your crankcase, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But what you're losing in maybe 1 or 2 horsepower and a little bit of crankcase pressure control is made up for in how strong this design is. And some of these can be had at great prices. This is an Eagle in my hand here, and of course we have the very famous in the LS world, of course, the Cali's Comstar. These are a great budget forged H-beam rod. Again, ARP hardware. These have a very, very strong design. And of course, the rod end, the rod journal end, and the piston pin end. These 1,000 horsepower all day long in a well-tuned LS application reliably. So definitely something we'd recommend here. But you heard me talk about this one here. This goes back to an I-beam design, and you're thinking, well, that's going backwards, and it's not. They're actually kind of working out new architecture with the I-beam style rods, like a Manly Turbo Tough rod here. This has ARP 2000 hardware, so it's another step up. The piston pin area has been bolstered a whole lot to handle that extra loading, shock loading from nitrous hits, from boost spikes, or some of you guys that drift, you're definitely going to need something like this because it's going to beat up the connecting rods quite a bit. These are very strong, but they also tend to be just a little bit lighter than an H-beam design just because of the shape. So these are making a big comeback. These are a little pricey, but definitely worth it for you guys that are making big horsepower. Before I step into the big head honcho here on my left, this here is the titanium Ls7 connecting rod. I wanted to touch base on these a little bit. Now, a lot of people think Ls7, they think, well, don't boost, that's a big thing, don't boost them. You know, they don't last when you spray them or you boost them. The thing is that these are plenty strong, but with a 4-inch stroke, big bore, we do recommend upgrading to a stronger rod and piston. Even though the LS9 also had titanium connecting rods, these were designed differently. As you can see, they're a little thinner in some areas because these were meant for a road race application that GM tuned for the street, kind of. And man, are these lightweight. I know you can't see this, but there is a massive weight difference in between a 4340 forged rod for boost and something that was never meant to see boost. It was meant to see RPMs reliably all day long. There's a massive difference in weight in these things. And that leads me to the big guy. This is what you call an aluminum connecting rod. None of you street guys are probably ever going to need anything like this, but there is a need for something like this. And as you can see, these are absolutely massive to get that strength, but they're also lightweight, much like the titanium. As you can see, if you were to put this in there, you would also need to do some heavy clearancing because of how much more meat is on these things. Now, if you're ever needing a build that needs an aluminum connecting rod like this, it's best to give the guys in our race shop a call. Those guys are real experts, combined decades of experience in building anything from circle track small blocks to street boosted LS engines. And of course, what they're really famous for is some of their super high horsepower, supercharged big blocks. So please give us a ring if you guys ever have any questions here. And of course, our race shop a ring too if you really want to talk about some of the real big stuff here for your next build next season. We really appreciate you guys stopping by for another one of our weekly tech videos. I really hope I was able to answer some of the questions here, maybe a few little misconceptions on how all this worked out or what it was used for. If you ever have any other questions, comments, anything like that, Facebook, YouTube, of course, the message system on our SD Parts website, we always try our best to read those as quickly as possible, at least give you some sort of response. Some of these ideas we've gotten from our websites and our social media. Other ones we answer directly to help you guys out in a quicker form. So once again, thank you for stopping by. Give us a like, subscribe, and share so we can share this information with everybody else. See you next week.